Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome formally. And thank you for joining us for this panel on the weaponization of discourses about anti-Semitism and anti-Hindu bias. I'm Ramya Vijaya, Professor of Economics and Global Studies at Stockton. This panel was motivated by two events that Stockton was a part of last year. Before we begin the formal session today, we would like to take a few moments to introduce this context in two parts. I will begin with the first event. Stockton joined departments and centers at over 40 American universities at the Dismantling Global Hindutva Conference in September 2021. The conference was intended to investigate the recent ascendance of the political philosophy of Hindutva in India. Originating in the early 20th century, Hindutva aims for the creation of a pure Hindu state to the exclusion of India's sizable and varied non-Hindu population. The current ruling regime in India is a Hindutva-aligned political party. Since coming to power in 2014, and more recently since 2019, the escalation of violence against religious minorities and other marginalized communities in India is well documented. Just last week, a New York Times report noted that hate speech in India has reached dangerous levels with open call for anti-Muslim violence and genocide moving into the mainstream. The DGH conference was intended to investigate the power and threat of Hindutva in India and globally through diaspora politics and as part of a rising wave of majoritarian nationalism. However, some diaspora Indian groups falsely portrayed this conference as an attack on all Hindus everywhere, particularly Hindu Americans on American university campuses. Stockton and other universities received a barrage of thousands of emails a day proclaiming this falsehood. Scholars and speakers at the conference received threats of violence through email and social media. The concerted efforts to disrupt this conference by falsely implying that it is a threat to all Hindus represented a grave threat to academic freedom. The DGH conference is not an isolated event. Even some Hindu groups in the US and elsewhere attempt to shut down any discussion of Hindutva by claiming anti-Hindu bias. As non-white immigrants and minorities, Indian Americans who are not only Hindus, undoubtedly face multiple kinds of biases and marginalization in America. Neither the conference nor this panel today is intended to negate that. However, it is possible to examine violence and power dynamics within communities in one specific context without negating the bias faced by the community in a different context. There is an urge for minority protection to shut down discussion about other vulnerable groups. But this co-option of the language is, of course, not American Hindu groups alone. I will now hand over to my further.
Thank you, Ramya. Thank you. My name is Raz Siegel. I'm Associate Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Stockton. And it's relevant to mention in this context that I've been conducting research, publishing, and teaching about the Holocaust, genocide, state violence, Jewish history, and anti-Semitism for about 15 years now. The weaponization of the discourse about anti-Semitism in the last few years as a tool to silence critique of Israeli policies, Israeli military occupation and settler colonialism, and Israeli violence against Palestinians, and as a tool to attack those working to support the Palestinian struggle for justice and freedom, especially Palestinians and particularly in the academic world. This bothers me, especially as a Jew and as a scholar of Jewish history and the Holocaust. Last April, the Master of Arts in Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Stockton, the MAG program, partnered with Congregation Rodef Shalom in Philadelphia, a large Jewish Reform congregation, and with the Feinstein Center for American Jewish History at Temple University, also in Philadelphia, to organize a discussion on this weaponization. its effect on the struggle against rising anti-Semitism in the US, its impact on Palestinians, and the threat it poses to free speech on US campuses. We invited Kenneth Stern, head of the Bard Center for the Study of Hate at Bard College, and an important figure in the American Jewish world in the struggle against anti-Semitism. And we also invited Joyce Sajlani, a Palestinian American who serves as the General Secretary of the American Friends Service Committee. The event came under a violent attack by Jews, which surprised the organizers. Violent, since those attacking the event resorted precisely to what it aimed to examine: wild accusations of anti-Semitism and an attack against Joyce Sajlani based on lies that had been proven as lies. Truth, however, was no obstacle for those attacking the event. Their aim was clear. Like Hindu nationalist groups, they wanted to shut down any and all discussion. And for good reason from their perspective, as by spring 2021, many around the world, including many Jews, had been writing, speaking, and working to expose the weaponization of the discourse about anti-Semitism as a method to silence critique of Israeli policies and violence against Palestinians. Many called out the abuse of the historical struggle of a vulnerable people, Jews, under attack by powerful states, to blur the attack of a powerful state, Israel, against a vulnerable group, Palestinians. Others focused more on how this weaponization blurs the continued vulnerability of Jews in the present, as is evident primarily from the attacks against Jews by white supremacists and racist nationalists from Charlottesville, North Carolina, to Budapest in Hungary. Many therefore stood with the organizers. Dozens of scholars of Jewish history and the Holocaust from around the world, for instance, sent letters in support of the event at Stockton. The attempt to shut down the discussion failed. More than 200 people joined the webinar. The discussion that unfolded raises many questions. Indeed, there is much to think about, much to learn. That is the aim of academic and public discussions, to prompt learning about complex issues, which we hope would suggest new paths of addressing them and new opportunities to imagine futures beyond conflict, oppression, and state violence. The attack against the dismantling global Hinduphobia conference shortly after the attack against the event on the weaponization of anti-Semitism made it clear to Ramya and to me that a comparative discussion may be useful, that broadening the discussion beyond just one case may shed light on issues and questions that are not unique to Israel, India, Jews, Hindus, and other states and groups, though each case has, of course, specific elements, but rather point to key problems in the world around us today. And so, it is a pleasure and an honor to introduce our panelists. Sravya Tadepalli is a board member of Hindus for Human Rights, a nonprofit organization that advocates against Hindu nationalism and caste from a Hindu faith perspective. Her article, Deconstructing Anti-Hindu Sentiment, Fighting Prejudice Against Hindus Should Not Preclude Introspection, was published in American Kahani last spring. She is also a 2018 Truman Scholar. Sanjay Mishra is an associate professor of political science and international relations at Drew University. He specializes in immigrant political incorporation, transnationalism, diaspora, and racial and ethnic politics. His work engages with political participation of South Asian immigrants in the United States, as well as countries of origin, with a particular focus on immigrants from India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. He has also been analyzing the experiences of Muslim American communities with law enforcement agencies. He has received his PhD in political science from the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. He served as the co-chair of Asian and Pacific American Caucus of the American Political Science Association from 2014 to 16. He's also a member of the Western Political Science Association's Committee on the Status of Asian Pacific Americans in the Profession. His book, This is Divided, The Political Lives of South Asian Americans, was published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2016 and by Sage India in 2017. The book was awarded the Best Book on Asian America in 2017 by the American Sociological Association section on Asia and Asian America. Rabbi Elisa Weiss is a community organizer, ritual leader, and organizational steward with over 2 decades of movement building experience. She was a staff leader at Jewish Voice for Peace from 2011 to 2021, serving as co-director of organizing, interim executive director, and deputy director. She is in demand as a public speaker and opinion writer with work in outlets including The Guardian and Newsweek. She is currently co-authoring a book that collects the organizing lessons from her decade at Jewish Voice for Peace for the benefits of all those seeking to build sustainable functioning organizations and movements against towering odds. Rabbi Weiss lives in West Philadelphia, where she facilitates and coaches human rights and movement building NGOs towards deeper strategy, organizing, and leadership. Joshua Shaines is Associate Professor of Jewish Studies and Director of the Arnold Center for Israel Studies at the College of Charleston. He has published widely on modern Jewish politics, religion, and culture, as well as on anti-Semitism and contemporary American politics, in academia and in popular journals. His first book, Diaspora, Nationalism, and Jewish Identity in Habsburg Galicia, appeared with Cambridge University Press in 2012. He's currently writing a history of Jewish Orthodoxy from its German origin into the 21st century. Thanks to all of you for joining us. The event will proceed in the following way. We've asked the panelists to prepare responses to 2 questions, about 7-8 minutes for each question. This should leave us with around 40 minutes for further discussion and questions from the audience. Ramya and I will be monitoring the Q&A box and will make an effort to raise in discussion as many of the questions as possible. Please try to keep your questions short and to the point. With this, I turn to the first question. What are the key elements or issues, in your view, in these discourses of weaponization that we're focusing on today? And we'll proceed in the following order with Sanjay, Sravya, Elisa, and then Josh. Please.
Thank you so much, Rahaz and Ramya, for the invitation and for your introduction. I am I have experienced this because Drew was also a part of the DGH conference and we were a co-signer and we experienced the same thing that Stockton experienced. And so it was a first-hand experience, and we all know about Hindu nationalist mobilization in India and abroad, but the ferocity with which the attack came was quite surprising and took us aback. 40,000 emails over 7 days. University was completely paralyzed, and they were trying to figure out ways to deal with that, right? So completely understand the ways in which it operates. So to the question, I want to talk about a couple of things and give a couple of examples to make it clear. The introduction was great. I think introduction laid out some of the dynamics of what is happening through examples. So one point that I want to make at the beginning is that if we want to understand this whole process of weaponizing anti-Hindu bias, or what they have started calling Hinduphobia, right? If you want to understand that, then we need to be very straightforward and simple about the nature of it, right? There is great degree of simplicity in this, right? So the whole mobilization of Hinduphobia is geared towards presenting or defending politics of oppression in the country back home, right? So the politics of oppression in India is very sophisticated, highly developed, and it's targeting Muslims, Christians, Dalit castes, and other minorities, right? And so there is a way in which the politics of anti-Hindu discrimination, the weaponization of anti-Hindu discrimination or Hinduphobia, is meant to create a defense of that politics, right? And so there's a very simple purpose behind this politics, and that simple purpose is to defend the politics of oppression, defend the politics of Hindu nationalism, defend the politics of what in India people call Hindutva, right? And so that's a very simple goal of this whole mobilization. And I'll talk about two examples to illustrate how it operates. And those two examples are from a very recent past. So the first example is of, and both examples are coming from their own narrative about how they define Hinduphobia, right? And so they use these two examples to define Hinduphobia, particularly in the last 3 to 4 years. So the first example that I want to use is that of Citizenship Amendment Act, CAA, which was a law passed in India in 2019. And the law is fairly complicated, but there is a, just to explain it very quickly, the law says that if you are a Buddhist, Jain, Parsi, Hindu, Christian, and Sikh from neighboring country, which is Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan, then you have right to asylum in India. Or if you have been living in India before 2014, you can get legalized. But what they do in that law is that they in a very targeted way, they exclude Muslims from that list. So if you are a Muslim, you cannot seek asylum in India, right? And so this was perhaps the first time that India used religion to decide who can seek asylum and who cannot seek asylum, right? And so in that law, Muslims were clearly barred from seeking asylum, right? So that's one part of Citizenship Amendment Act. And the second part of the whole controversy that erupted after that was another law which has been in place for a while, which is called NRC, National Registration of Citizenship, right? And NRC was meant to create a national register of citizens, right? And so every citizen is listed in that national registry, right? It was implemented in state like Assam, but the plan is to implement that across the nation in India, right? And so if you combine these two laws, then it's entirely possible that Muslims in India who have lived for generation, if they can't produce birth certificate, if they can't produce voter ID, if they can't produce other such documents, then they can be declared illegal. They can be declared persona non grata, right? And so that the combination of the two produced a very deep level of anxiety and anger among secular forces as well as Muslims living in India, right? And there was massive mobilization in India against CAA and NRC. And I don't know if people have heard about Shaheen Bagh mobilization in Delhi, where Muslim women came together and mobilized and really created a sort of an excellent mode of organizing where people from all across came and supported, right? And the movement was reaching its peak around when the pandemic started breaking, and that basically made it very difficult for movement to continue. Now, why is it important for us in this context? It's important because the issue came to the US and issue became deeply discussed in diasporic context, also in many of the congressional hearings. And one of the things that people who are sort of proposing this idea of Hinduphobia or anti-Hindu bias, they took this as an example of to illustrate that anyone who critiques CAA, anyone who critiques NRC, anyone who critiques Narendra Modi government and BJP government for allowing Hindus to seek asylum in India is actually Hinduphobic, right? And so the attempt was to completely shut down any conversation on CAA, NRC in the US, right? And so that's one example of how they are trying to define Hinduphobia, right? And very quickly, the second example that I want to talk about is the issue of Kashmir. Again, people know about Kashmir. Kashmir is one of the states of India, which has been from its very beginning. It has been disputed, and people of Kashmir have always protested against accession of Kashmir into India, and it has always been a burning issue in Indian politics, right? And there has been at different moments in Indian history, there has been mobilization against Indian occupation, against forcible accession of Kashmir into India, right? And it has gone through different phases, right? In 2019, again, BJP government decided to scrap two constitutional provision, Article 370 and Article 35A. Article 370 and Article 35A are two provisions which allow Kashmir to have some kind of autonomous, some kind of special status among Indian states, right? And so that's a kind of formal acknowledgement of the fact that Kashmir is some kind of disputed territory, and we need to acknowledge that special status of Kashmir in Indian politics, right? And so what BJP did was scrap those and make Kashmir into one of the Indian states. Anybody can go and buy property in Kashmir, which was not possible before scrapping 370 and 35A, right? And so this was followed by heavy military crackdown on civilian population, and internet was there was blockade of internet for several weeks, right? And it created a very serious human rights crisis in Kashmir, which is ongoing, right? It came to diasporic context. There were congressional hearings on this, and it became very, very intense, particularly in the US, in diasporic conversation. There were protests, etc. The second example that people who deploy the concept of Hinduphobia, or people who deploy the concept of anti-Hindu discrimination in diasporic context, this is the second example that they give, right? That this is an example of Hinduphobia, right? And so if we think about these two examples, then it's very clear that the way in which the term Hinduphobia is being deployed, it is meant to suppress any conversation on these two very important and contentious issues in Indian politics, right? And both of them are connected to minorities. Both of them are connected to Muslims, right? And so I took these examples because I watched a whole conference that Hindu Student Council, which had organized a conference on Hinduphobia at Rutgers. And in that conference, they used these two examples to illustrate how Hinduphobic the dominant left is, the American media is, the American establishment is, right? And so, this will give you a sense of how the politics of Hinduphobia is shaping and how it is evolving. I think I will stop here because I think I have taken enough time, and I'll get back to some other points when I come to the second question. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sanjay. Sravya, please.
Yeah, so Sanjay did a really good job of laying out a lot of the issues, particularly in India. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the diasporic context. But I grew up Hindu in a pretty white area, a lot of Mormons, very Christian. It's a little bit more rural than urban. And so I did experience when I was young a lot of these anti-Hindu incidents. For example, I had classmates who tried to tell me my religion was false and get me to convert to Christianity. I had teachers that didn't represent my religion fairly in the classroom. When I was a college student at the University of Oregon, a couple of my friends and I tried to start a Hindu Student Association club. And basically a student journalist kind of started it, where he asked us if we had any connection with the Rajneeshis and if we were open to everyone and all these weird questions. And so people started going around saying that we were a cult, and then nobody wanted to join the club. So the club ended up just dying, pretty much because of that rhetoric that was floating around. I had a friend in Minnesota, and some white teenagers entered their temple and broke all the heads of all the gods. So I think it is important to recognize that there is this reality of discrimination that you face if you're of really any minority religious community in the US, and including if you're Hindu. And I think that framing, though, is really important, because when all of these things happened to me, I always believed it was a function of being a religious minority, and not necessarily because I was Hindu. Like, some things certainly were uniquely because I was Hindu, but a lot of these experiences could have happened to Muslims, it could have happened to Jewish students, it could have happened to Sikh students. And it was this product of white Christian supremacy, as well as some things that were maybe more explicitly anti-Hindu. And every time these incidents happened, it was always my friends who were from minority religious communities that stood by me. Like, when we were struggling to get this Hindu Student Association going, my Muslim friends came to every single meeting just to have people there to just show support for us and like help us to just get along a little bit longer. And I think that that's just a really, really important part of this conversation, is that if the calls about Hinduphobia were in any way sincere, they would be standing up for every single religious minority community. But what we know is that the Hindu right will only ever speak up for Hindus. And when they speak up, they're not speaking up on issues that I think actually matter or affect Hindus. And for me, I'm against Hindu nationalism because of my experiences as a religious and cultural minority. And I don't want anyone to face marginalization for that basis. And I think, like Dr. Mishra said, it's really important to recognize that the weaponization of anti-Hindu sentiment doesn't come from a sincere strive for equality, but actually to shut down any criticism of the Hindu nationalist state. And so I want to point out 3 major examples in which, or issues where anti-Hindu sentiment is kind of being used as a talking point, or Hinduphobia is being used as a talking point, and talk about them a little bit. So the first, especially with regard to the DGH conference, what we're seeing is that right-wing Hindus are using anti-Hindu bias, or the idea of Hinduphobia, to oppose academic freedom and freedom of speech. And this is the same freedom of speech which gives minority communities the ability to have these views at all. But just the viciousness that we've seen from the Hindu right on these issues really shows, I mean, it doesn't actually have a tangible effect on the Hindu community, right? Like, if I don't like what's being said at the conference, I just don't go to the conference. And also, we have to remember that the conference is dealing with political issues that have nothing to do with faith, or have nothing to do with your individual ability to practice as a Hindu. And I think it's really important to say that criticism of Hindu nationalism, or Hinduism even, does not constitute anti-Hindu bias, especially when Hindus have the choice and the power to opt in and out of this protected speech. The second area I want to talk about is caste, which is maybe a little bit, it's related to the conversation, is why I want to mention it. But right-wing Hindus are using the rhetoric of anti-Hindu bias to fight caste discrimination resolutions. And we've seen this particularly with the new resolution against caste-based discrimination at Cal State University. These resolutions add caste as a protected class. That's what we've seen in most of these cases. And these should have no impact on most Hindus as long as they're not casteist, right? Like, these are directed towards Hindus who are being casteist, and it serves to protect people who are of oppressed caste backgrounds, right? And many of people who are oppressed caste backgrounds or face caste discrimination are Hindus. For example, one of the leaders of the Cal State University anti-caste process identifies as a Nepali Hindu, right? So this whole entire rhetoric that caste discrimination resolutions discriminate against Hindus, they're really talking about upper caste Hindus. And there's actually no evidence that this would even really affect them at all. We know that, for example, gender resolutions are going to disproportionately affect men. racism resolutions are going to disproportionately affect white people. That's not a reason that they shouldn't exist, is because they might disproportionately affect one community, which is the argument of the Hindu right. And what we also know is that in most of these cases about sexism and racism, nothing ever happens. So really there's very, very little to fear. And this entire fight is really just about preserving caste supremacy and just trying to preserve this idea of Hinduism as this perfect religion when we know that it has a history of oppression. And then the third point I want to say is that right-wing Hindus say that Hindutva is the only form of legitimate Hinduism. This is something they're really trying to push both in America and in India. But to me, my Hinduism and the Hinduism of many others in my family and my community is completely different from Hindutva Hinduism. When I was growing up, we went to Shirdi Sai Baba bhajans, and Shirdi Sai Baba is considered, he's a saint who believed that Hinduism and Islam were the same. And he thought that, there should be kind of this one faith that combines elements of Hinduism and elements of Islam. And I also grew up with a Hinduism that believed that every human being is divine. And that was a core value for me. And that was also a reason why I actively believe in opposing discrimination. But Hindu nationalists want to push down this idea that everyone believes in the same Hinduism and this is what it is. And if you oppose that idea, you're not really a Hindu. I get called not a real Hindu all the time. And another thing that's important to mention is that when we're talking about these India cases, for example, the CAA and Kashmir, fighting for human rights for Muslims or for Hindus who might be Hindu pundits, for example, or people who are fleeing Pakistan, does not negate our ability to stand for the human rights of Muslims, Christians, and Dalits in India. But the Hindu right wants to push this narrative that it's one or the other. But the crux of it was that if we are actually fighting for equality here, we should be fighting for equality for everyone, not just Hindus. The Hindu right is not standing up for Muslims and Dalits. We know this is not about civil rights or equality, but a way to prop up Hindutva rhetoric to people who are not naturally sympathetic. That's what this discourse is trying to do. And to just kind of tie this up, so one thing that happened recently in my home state of Oregon is that the state tried to ban the symbols, the swastika, in public schools. And I brought this up as an issue, like, hey, maybe we should talk about this, or because a swastika is a holy symbol in Hinduism, maybe we can use Nazi imagery or some other word to kind of describe that. And two of our closest advocates in this kind of conversation with the Oregon Department of Education was our local rabbi in Corvallis and Sami El-Abdrabba, who was a Muslim school board member. And the reason they stood with me and fought with other Hindus in our community is because they saw this as an issue that affected religious minorities. And that is what we should actually advocate for, solidarity with other communities that are facing oppression. And that's actually how we can combat discrimination and for everyone of all communities. So I'll end there.
Thank you very much, Sravya. Lisa, please.
Hi, thank you. I'm so glad we're having this conversation, and thank you for inviting me. So drawing these connections, between how these religious nationalist governments are sharing not only weapons, right, which we know Israel and India are doing, but also propaganda strategies, right? And so understanding kind of how these are linked is actually really essential. And I'm really excited that we're getting this chance to have this conversation. And I think it's important because I think we have to, in order to dismantle the weaponization of anti-Semitism and anti-Hindu bias, which can only happen together in my view, we have to also at the same time challenge both Hindutva and Zionism, political ideologies that both rely on systems of violence and control to ensure a religious majority, to deny rights to minority populations, with a lack of respect for human rights. And as I've learned more about this through my work with Hindus for Human Rights, I found the parallels are really striking, and they're actually really informative of the commonalities between contemporary manifestations of religious nation states and the right-wing politics that are actually inherent to them. So some of the recent, this is not exhaustive, but off the top of my head, the parallels are so a few months ago, Israel declared 6 human rights organizations as terrorist organizations, right? And regularly, right, there's reports of India routinely jailing human rights defenders, right? So there's a commonality there about the attack on the human rights field and sector. You know, in the communal arena, you know, the Jewish Communal Organization, the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, regularly declares anti-Zionist Jews as anti-Semitic, and the Hindu American Foundation is suing Hindus for human rights, right? So there's like these same kinds of like intercultural fights that are actually also happening. And also really striking is that for how it manifests on the ground, I recently learned about the political conflict and religious desecration happening at Babri Masjid in Ayodhya as the revered birthplace of the deity Rama, I understand. And that's very parallel, strikingly parallel to the horrific nationalist violence that surrounds the Cave of the Patriarchs in the West Bank city of Hebron, right? So that's like particular to religious nationalism is the way that these religious sites become these focal points for fighting these political battles. And these parallels are reminders too that there's really urgency to having this conversation, right? It's not theoretical, they're actually real life harms that the weaponizers are actually trying to hide, I think, responsibility for. And I actually, as I was preparing my notes for tonight, I was just thinking a lot about Sheikh Jarrah, which is a Palestinian neighborhood in East Jerusalem, which is currently being ethnically cleansed through like violence by Jewish religious nationalists. And so I just wanted to invite everybody to follow along, Save Sheikh Jarrah. I'll put it in the chat. Everyone can follow along on social media and signal boost what's happening there on the ground, because it's really important. Okay, so let's talk about anti-Semitism. So first things first, I feel like I want to define the terms and like what I mean when I talk about anti-Semitism. So for this discussion, when I talk about anti-Semitism, I'm talking about discrimination, prejudice, hostility, or violence against Jews as Jews. It takes many forms, which can include violence, threats of violence, repeating or circulating anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, and other kinds of aggressions. And I think a really important piece, which is a lot of progressive Jewish groups have pointed out who are speaking out and up around anti-Semitism, and that is that anti-Semitism is part of the machinery of division and fear that's created and used for specific political or material gain. And in my view, the fight against anti-Semitism is inseparable from the struggles against racism and xenophobia and hatred of ethnic and religious groups. So now we turn to what's going on with those that weaponize accusations of bias to shield India and Israel from criticism for human rights abuses. And as far as the key elements, I kind of see 2 main issues. The first is that this weaponization that's going on distorts and upends solidarity between marginalized communities, which we actually ought to be celebrating and encouraging. So that's a first danger. So, you know, I was raised in a traditional Jewish environment that did ingrain into me a core lesson of the Holocaust and why Jews need Israel is because the world turned their backs on the Jews during the Nazi Holocaust. And the lesson that I was taught to take from that is that Jews are on their own in the world and need to protect themselves through a militarized nation state. And what I learned as I grew up is that there's actually another way, which is through profound relationships of solidarity with all people. That's another path to Jewish safety. From the inception of the political Zionist movement, there's been wide disagreement about this and everything in Jewish communities. So the founder of political Zionism, Theodor Herzl, himself was a secular Jew, not religious, and he absorbed the idea that Jews were a problem that needed to be solved for European society. So deeply embedded inside of Zionism that we are now living with and Palestinians live under is an awful idea that safety only comes from isolation. I don't think that's true. when we look at it from the point of view of the weaponizers, so these weaponizers, those that are weaponizing anti-Semitism and Hindu bias, but I'm speaking more directly to anti-Semitism right now, I try to think about like, how are they seeing the world, right? Like, what's their worldview? And I think my read is that they see a lot of the same things that I see and that you might see, but take something different from it. So they see the racial justice uprising of the past few years. They see the intersectionality discourses that have emerged. They see how the Trump years have woken up so many to the realities of white supremacy and xenophobia in American culture. The problem is that these weaponizers see these phenomenon as levers to pull to promote their agendas, as PR strategies. So part of the logic I see is that when a charge of anti-Semitism is made or a charge of anti-Hindu bias is made, they're betting, and rightly, right, that it will be addressed and engaged with seriously, just as people take charges of anti-Black racism or transphobia or sexism, right? And it should be. And so they're conflating their political agendas with their religious identities and using that to shield themselves from criticism. You know, at this point, most everyone who speaks up for Palestine in one way or another has been lodged with an accusation that their voice for justice and freedom for Palestinians is anti-Jewish, right? Just like Sravya, you said you've been called anti-Hindu. I've been called not a real Jew, or like not a real Hindu. I've been called not a real Jew more times than I can count, right? But in my view, these are actually wolf cries of anti-Semitism, and they themselves are an actual threat to Jewish safety. So the second, and in my view, actually really most important issue that I see around these discourses of weaponization that I think is really important to name and understand is that this weaponization is actually a coordinated campaign that's being funded to the tune of millions of dollars, right? It's not something that just happens to be happening, right? It's a strategy, right? In order to shield human rights abusers from critique and accountability. So again, I'm going to focus on Israel and the Jewish community because that's what I know the most about. But I'm sure there's, similar things happening and others, I'm hoping that through the discussion, we can hear what the parallels are that you hear as I describe this. So the Israeli government, in concert with Israel advocacy organizations, particularly in the United States, including the ADL, the American Jewish Committee, and the Simon Wiesenthal Center, these organizations have long collaborated to ensure that Israel is shielded from accountability through solidifying a definition of anti-Semitism that conflates it with anti-Zionism, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, and broadly the movement for justice for Palestinians. And so the main tool that they're using now is a definition of anti-Semitism called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, or commonly referred to as the IHRA. And it was drafted over 15 years ago to be used as a tool for data collection and education of law enforcement in Europe. And Roz, as you were saying in your introduction, Ken Stern, who you invited to that original panel, was one of the lead drafters of that when he worked at the American Jewish Committee. So this definition, and Ken Stern, who was one of the authors, is now one of the most vocal critics of the way that it's being used, because it was never meant to be enshrined in legislation or policies by universities or governments, but that's exactly what's happening now. So, the definition, actually, you might have heard in the past few weeks, there's been a case where the IHRA definition has come into play, actually in the United Kingdom, through a professor named Shad Abu Salama. She's a Palestinian professor who was hired as an associate lecturer at Sheffield Hallam, I hope I'm saying that right, University of the United Kingdom. And within 2 weeks of her announcement, she was suspended after the administration there capitulated to the smear campaign that was launched, claiming that she was anti-Semitic using this IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. And the main thrust of the attack was based on a Twitter thread in which she defended a first-year university student who had written on a placard at a protest, "Stop the Palestinian Holocaust." So that was the thing that was being used as a claim that she is anti-Semitic, that the university was anti-Semitic for hiring her. Now, her story ends well. They were able to overturn that suspension due to rallying of community support. And through the European Legal Support Center, which is a European organization, much like Palestine Legal here in the US. But I still think, combating the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism and particularly on college campuses, is going to be a defining and urgent struggle for the Palestinian rights movement in the coming years. You know, and I think, especially in light of the racial justice awakening and this appropriation of the language of the left by these weaponizers, these charges of anti-Semitism and of anti-Hindu bias are likely to be more successful. And so we have to combat these strategically, but we also have to do so morally, because what we learned from the story of the boy who cries wolf is when the wolf really comes, he's alone. And that's what really makes me nervous as a Jew, knowing the rising anti-Semitism in this country. So there's one last piece, if it's okay, just to go into before I wrap, is that in doing some research, as I've started to kind of like be curious about these connections, about the coordination between the Israeli government and the Indian government from the propaganda side, I feel like a lot has been done about the weapons and military, you know, sharing. But you know, it's interesting. One thing I found, so the American Jewish Committee, who I mentioned before, commissioned the HfHR definition of anti-Semitism that likens critique of Israel with anti-Semitism. They are actually have a very specific role in the weaponization as it relates to Israel and India. So they have within their organization an Asia Pacific Institute, whose purpose, they say, is to cultivate and maintain relationships in the region. And recently, just in December of 2021, the head of that Asia Pacific Institute wrote an article exploring the relationship between anti-Semitism and anti-Hindu bias, much what we are, but from a different point of view. And when I'm done, I'll put the link in the chat for people who are curious. But in it, she writes, and I'm quoting this article, "Just as Zionists are called racist and Islamophobes in some US circles, Hindu Indians are also called Islamophobes. Just as the true loyalty of American Jews is asserted to be Israel, the loyalty of Indian American Hindus is asserted to be India. The two communities, Indian Hindus and Jews, find themselves uniquely aligned in battles they face, primarily on college campuses, but growingly and alarmingly in city councils such as Seattle." Okay, so that's the end of her quote. So I was curious what happened in Seattle. So in Seattle, and actually, Sanjay, you spoke a little bit to this around the Citizens Amendment Act and the National Register of Citizens. So what they were referring to there is in Seattle, the city council passed a resolution in 2020 urging India's parliament to repeal those acts, kind of because of the far right politics that they represent. So that was the example of like the anti-Hindu bias. And the example of the anti-Jewish bias was the Seattle City Council discussed, but also ultimately did not pass a resolution brought by a coalition of groups, which sought to end the Seattle Police Department's exchanges and trainings with any military, police, or security forces from any country that violates human rights. So it wasn't specifically targeting Israel, yet it still managed to be smeared as anti-Semitic and stopped from being passed, even as the spirit of the legislation was to challenge the way these police exchange programs promote state violence and attack civil rights that disproportionately affect Palestinians and Black people. So in both of these examples, we see that it's not just about Jews or Hindus, it's about Zionism and Hindutva. It's about political ideologies rooted in religious supremacy that are at odds with justice, rights, and dignity. The weaponizers succeed often because they are betting on the goodwill of the liberal democratic American population to want to fight oppression and to preserve religious freedoms. And it is that empathy that they're wielding as a weapon. So in the Torah, the prayer we offer is for swords to be turned into plowshares. What's happening with the way that the weaponizers are using anti-Semitism and Hinduphobia is just the opposite. They're taking plowshares, expressions of solidarity with Palestinian people, those eschewing apartheid, those rejecting Islamophobia, and turning those into swords. They're not swords, they're weapons. And they're not weapons, they're not swords, they are righteous expressions of human solidarity, and we have a moral duty to return them to plowing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Josh, please.
Thank you. So thank you so much for inviting me to join this really important conversation, and I've learned so much. And also when you announced the original order, I was excited to go last, but of course the downside is I've heard such learned comments. It's hard to follow that act. but I'll do the best I can. You know, the story that inspired this meeting with Ken Stern and the other one as well, there's an irony there, which is, as Weiss said, Ken Stern is the author of the IHRA definition that is so often used in opposition to these events. And the irony that he's the one being protested as being, you know, anti-Semitic for being anti-Zionist doesn't get lost on me. And the parallelism that you bring together with these conversations is absolutely vital, which is, by the way, also at the heart of Ken's project, right? He's starting the Hate Studies Center at Bard College, where he really wants to see how there is an innate human nature to do certain acts of hatred and to defend hatred in various ways that goes beyond a single culture or a single political conflict. And so there again is absolutely phenomenal. When, as Weiss mentioned, when you mentioned, Sravya, about being accused of being a false Hindu, I too have been accused of being a Gino, which is a Jew in name only, like a rhino, but a Gino. In fact, I found such accusations posted on social media on Saturdays, which I didn't find until Saturday night, because as a religious Jew, I don't use the computer on Saturday until after sunset. So I found accusations that I was a false Jew or a bad Jew or a traitor to Judaism on Saturday night by people who posted it that morning. That always made me laugh. And indeed, when we think about this comparison of weaponization, it's hard to imagine a case more obviously so than anti-Zionism, because we see it literally being weaponized in Trump's executive order, which I think is still on the books as far as I know, and as well as the legislation that literally criminalizes not only nonviolent economic boycott of Israel, which, by the way, as a director of a Center for Israel Studies, I do go to Israel. But there's no question in my mind that BDS, that nonviolent boycott, is quintessentially the most nonviolent thing you can do to influence the behavior of a state or a company. But not only is that being criminalized, but even advocacy itself, even rhetoric itself. And I'll tell you how I got to that in just a moment. And as Ray Weiss said, there's a real urgency here and a danger here. The most obvious danger here is to the victims of the Israeli state, which is the Palestinians. And I don't want to, for a second, I don't want to forget that. I don't want to say, when I'm concerned as a Jew about Judaism and Jews, I don't want to forget about the actual victims of the Israeli state. But at the same time, there is a danger for Jews. There is the issue of crying wolf. There is the issue of how you define anti-Semitism. You know, there was a lot of discussion last week or 2 weeks ago about Whoopi Goldberg. And, you know, I wasn't thrilled with their comment. I thought it was problematic. I thought the criticisms were outrageous, but I was happy there was a conversation. But the same week, at the same time as Holocaust Remembrance Day, Tucker Carlson, who is by far the most watched popular figure in cable news, had a virulently, traumatically almost for me, anti-Semitic screed against George Soros that could have come out of 1920s, 1930s fascist Europe. It was horrifying. And yet this somehow doesn't get the attention it needs because it doesn't fit into this. So the question was, what are the key elements or issues in these discourses of weaponization? So let me just, if I may, tell you how I come to this. I was trained in Zionism, anti-Semitism, and nationalism, and how these things intersect. I was trained, by the way, while living as a Hasidic Jew in the West Bank. I have a sort of a second life that I used to have. And from my perspective coming out of that, it's a reason why I'm not there anymore. I tend to view nationalism as generally a negative phenomenon. I know that it can have positive work in motivating anti-colonialism and so on, but I'm always concerned about the sort of chauvinist view within nationalism that views one's own nationalist mythology, one's own nationalist cause as self-evident, as obvious, as true, as naturally good, but tends to view others as fake, as less than, and particularly the other with whom you're in competition, as less than, as fake, and therefore is subject to different treatment. When it comes to anti-Semitism, here I think what everybody said is absolutely correct, but I would add to that for myself, it seems to me that it's the mythology of anti-Semitism that we need to understand. If you want to address, which I will in a moment, the weaponization of the charge, we have to begin by understanding what we're talking about. Anti-Semitism is an ideology that imagines a collective Jewish body that is engaged in a global conspiracy to undermine national sovereignty and humankind overall, but above all, national sovereignty. That's why the conflation of Israel and diaspora Jews, which is so often assumed by those who are trying to suppress speech, That's why that conflation is considered anti-Semitic, because it assumes a conspiracy of Jews around the globe that is at the heart of anti-Semitism. Now, I came into this because the HfHR definition, which Ken Stern initially wrote with broad definitions as a vague sense to collect data, was being weaponized. And one of the first places it got weaponized before Trump issued his executive order, which weaponized that definition, before there was legislation in Congress, South Carolina was ground zero, where I'm teaching, was ground zero to legislate the HfHR definition in a way that was deliberately and specifically targeting universities and colleges. It specifically would have essentially targeted me personally as an anti-Semite if I taught a Palestinian narrative. And I'll explain more about what I mean by what that narrative is and what's being targeted. And therefore, I came to it quite personally. I tried to write against it. I was successful at first. There was a senator who filibustered it and sort of stopped it, but then they snuck it in under a must-pass budget bill, as you know, deep down in the budget bill, it was passed, and so now that's on the books. I imagine at some point I'm going to be brought up on some sort of accusation, I guess. Maybe I shouldn't say that publicly, but I'm sort of half waiting for it. So I became involved in other efforts to try to defang this weaponization. At first, I was involved with what's called the Nexus Task Force, a committee that was founded out of UCLA and now is at Bard College with Ken Stern, that tried to come up with a definition of anti-Semitism. By the way, it's interesting why there was so much focus on defining anti-Semitism. Why? There isn't so much focus on defining racism more generally. Why anti-Semitism? And obviously it's because of its weaponization, it's because it's being used to suppress speech, it's because of Israel. There's no other reason why that's being the focus. So this Nexus group tried to come up with the definition, and then the JDA, the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, which I was involved with Professor Siegel was involved with, to try to detangle anti-Israel criticism, anti-Zionist feeling and rhetoric, pro-Palestinian advocacy from actual anti-Semitism, because the stakes couldn't be higher for Palestinians, first and foremost, but also for Jews and for other minorities ultimately. And when you ask what is the key element in these weaponization, I would say the following. Number one, the obfuscation and use of logical fallacies to either avoid discussing or to justify an uncomfortable truth. That's what I'll discuss in a second, what I mean by that. I'll say it again, the obfuscation and use of logical fallacies to avoid discussing or justify an uncomfortable truth. This is then combined, secondly, with a lack of understanding of what actually constitutes anti-Semitism. Or rather, as in the case of the HfHR definition, vague language that seems to always conveniently, theoretically might not be applied in a way that restricts speech and restricts advocacy of Palestinian rights, but somehow always does. So a lack of awareness of what you're defending, combined with a lack of understanding of what actually constitutes anti-Semitism. Now, I'm not stupid. I'm aware that some are aware of this. Some people are very aware of what they are doing, that they are redefining anti-Semitism to mean criticism of the right-wing project in Israel, that they know what they're doing very much, but we really don't have much hope in reaching them. I'm interested in reaching people who defend what they call legitimate criticism of Israel. But somehow, what is the limits of that is what I'm talking about. What are they talking about? And when I say they're avoiding discussion through obfuscation or through circular fallacies. So let me try to exemplify that, if I may, with an incident that happened about a year ago. I was speaking in an interview with a very important Israeli intellectual. His name is Yossi Klein Halevi. His own personal narrative, he was a Kahanist, meaning a radical right-wing secular nationalist, Zionist, militant Zionist, racist, and so on. He wrote a memoir about how he left the Kahanist movement and he no longer supports that. Now he wants to live in peace theoretically and so on. And I take him at his word to a certain extent. And I interviewed him and I asked him to try to get a sense of his Overton window. Like, what's the limits to you? Because he went on a rant and he attacked Peter Beinart, who some of you may know who that is, who is a very prominent left-wing Jewish intellectual who is now a strong advocate of a sort of binational state in Israel-Palestine, a strong advocate of equal rights for Palestinians and for combating anti-Palestinian racism and so on. And he went on a rant attacking him as being outside the tent. What he's doing is anti-Semitism because he said he's undermining the project of Israel. He's undermining the project of Jewish sovereignty in Israel and Jewish rights in Israel. And so I said, okay, I have a very different view of Peter Beinart, who I think is an amazing person, a brilliant scholar, and also, by the way, a very deep believing Jew. But setting that aside, you also said earlier, I said to him, that you justified right-wing views, for example, the current prime minister, who advocates indefinite control of the West Bank, spreading of the settlements, and no equality for the Palestinians who live there. Why is that in the tent? And he sort of said, well, I disagree with it, but at least it's talking about, it's in the realm and it's talking. So I let it go because I was his host and what could I do? But I wrote an article and it led to a huge backlash in ways that I can't talk about even publicly, some of them. And I said the following: it seems to me, I said, that what does it mean to be anti-Israel in a legitimate way? And what does it mean to be anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian in an anti-Semitic way? And here's the definition of anti-Semitism that seems to be, and I've used this model over and over and over again, and I see it over and over and over again. Criticism of Israel or defense of Palestinians that advocates equality of power, that advocates an end to superior Jewish power, that is anti-Semitic. You test that, you'll see it's the case. Any policy that you advocate that is defending equality, this is by definition anti-Semitic. And this is what's being suppressed in executive orders and in legislative acts and on college campuses. This is what's being suppressed as anti-Semitic. So on the one hand, if you advocate equality and a binational reality, that's anti-Semitic. If you advocate permanent, what they call status quo, but in the West Bank, I think really without argument is some kind of apartheid reality, this is considered to be maybe wrong, but certainly not problematic or racist. And I think that's what's at stake here. That's what we have to understand. So when we talk about the key element, I'm rereading your question, the key elements, the discourse of weaponization. The key element is to understand what is actually being argued between the lines, what is actually being done. It is an uncomfortable truth in Israel-Palestine to argue that the current reality, as pretty much every human rights organization has done, that at least in the West Bank, I understand that some of you may have been following recent discourse, Amnesty International's report that says even in 1948, at the foundation of Israel, there was aspects of apartheid that go back that far. Other human rights groups disagree and say, no, it really begins with the West Bank occupation. And I understand there's that disagreement, and I'm not trying, and there should be a robust conversation about that. There should be a robust conversation about that, which is this discourse is trying to shut down. But what there has, at least in the West Bank, it's sort of indisputable that there's a reality of apartheid. If you want to call it colonialism, I don't really care. But the issue is, the issue is that this is uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to discuss this. It's uncomfortable to discuss Palestinian rights in this way. It is much easier to weaponize a discourse that says pro-Palestinian advocacy is at its core to call that anti-Semitic. And that's what we're seeing. And that's the reality on the ground right now. Not only that, but as Sravya was just mentioning, this then gets blended with notions of Jewish authenticity and Jewish legitimacy. The integration of Zionism and Judaism is very hard to tease apart in ways that are absolutely fundamental. And I think we have to address these things and understand, and I guess in the second question, we'll speak more how to address these things. But I think we have to understand that this is what's happening, this is what's at stake. And I'll end with this story. I'm very cognizant of the time. I know we're supposed to have 7 or 8 minutes, so I'm watching that clock. Last week, Deborah Lipstadt finally had her hearing to become the ambassador in charge of monitoring anti-Semitism around the world, or whatever the title exactly is. And a lot of what she said, actually, I agreed with, which I was surprised about. I often don't agree with her, but I very much agree with some of what she said. But there was one part that I thought was striking. When Senator Marco Rubio asked her about the Amnesty report, he characterized it as saying Israel is a unique evil in the world, which obviously the report does not do. But he also said, what do you think about this? And the response should have been, first of all, should have been, that's not really relevant to this conversation or this post. Or if she wanted to answer it, it should have been preceded by, that's not really relevant, here's what I happen to think about it. Or maybe you want to go ask somebody who's an expert in Israel-Palestine what they think about it. But what she said was, I disagree with it. That was what she said. And I don't know why they were writing this, intimating anti-Semitism. I don't know why they're writing this. She said, what was their motivations? I think the motivations are pretty clear. They wanted to describe the reality on the ground and advocate for Palestinian equality. I mean, it's not rocket science. It's pretty clear what they're advocating. You can disagree with them. I mean, they're not God. They might have made a mistake. Then argue with them. Talk, what's the reality on the ground that you see different? But they don't want to do that. It's much easier to say, this is anti-Semitism. You called it apartheid. This is anti-Semitism. Why? Where do you see the myth of Jewish power? And this can happen with Zionism. I'm not saying it doesn't. When somebody says Israel is a global superpower that pulls the strings as puppet master of governments all over the world, that's anti-Semitism. When someone says Israel is responsible for climate change or for 9/11, that is anti-Semitism. If you could pop out the word Israel and insert Rothschild from 100 years ago or Soros today, and the sentence still works, you have anti-Semitism. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about an analysis of a state. But it's much more comfortable just to say that's anti-Semitism. So I'll leave it at that and pass the baton.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So with this, we'll shift, it's a good gateway, what you just presented, Josh, to our second question. And again, about 7 minutes each of you, so we have enough time for discussions and some questions. So how do we indeed distinguish between weaponization and the legitimate expression of concerns about discrimination and hate? And more specifically, how do we shift the discourse back to focus on vulnerable groups rather than be distracted by the depiction of criticism of powerful states as an attack on particular communities? So I think we'll go with the same order. So please, Sanjay.
Thank you. I will be very quick. The first thing that I want to, excellent presentations, and I'm learning a lot as I'm listening to everyone. The first point that I want to note is that in the context of India, there is a longer history of Hindu supremacy, or the notion of persecution of Hindus and sort of the politics of Hindu nationalism. There is a longer history going back to early 20th century, going back to anti-colonial movement. But when we think about the notion that the emerging notion of Hinduphobia that is coming into discourse more and more, that is a very, very new discourse. That is, I would say, few years it has been into conversation, right? So it's a discourse. So when we compare the two, when we compare discourse around anti-Semitism and the complexities around that, and when we think about Hinduphobia, I feel that they are at very different planes, right? The whole discourse on Hinduphobia is emerging in the last, I would say, 5-7 years, when Hindu nationalist government came into power, and they are making diasporic mobilization as one of their main priorities, right? And so it's important for us, those of us who are trying to engage with this conversation, to acknowledge that there is still a very, very half-baked attempt to come up with something which sounds like a very thought out or very deeply sort of felt process. It's none of that. It's very ad hoc. It's very sort of half-baked, and one has to make that distinction between the two examples, that the example of anti-Semitism and Hinduphobia that we're talking about. To the question, I would say that the response to get back to some of these, some of the sort of important issues that these communities are facing in the US or in diaspora, the response is not to say that, and I'm particularly referring to Hindu community, the response is not to say that Hindus are not facing discrimination or Indians are not facing discrimination. The response is to expand the notion of discrimination that we are talking about, that discrimination that Hindus or Indians or South Asians are facing. They are multifaceted, right? It has multiple dimensions, right? So people are discriminated on the basis of their appearance, what they look like, right? In a particular moment in US politics, particularly 9/11 period, Hindus are discriminated because they are seen as Muslims, right? So Muslim appearing became a racial category, right? And so people are discriminated on the basis of their appearance, their skin color, their accent, their religion, their culture, all kinds of elements of discrimination that come into play. And since my scholarship is on South Asian immigrants in the US and their political participation, I constantly think about this question, right? That if we react to Hinduphobia or the whole discourse around Hinduphobia or how Hindus are being targeted by saying that, no, this is not an important issue, right? So saying that Hinduphobia is not important is one thing, but what immigrant community, what Indian American community, what larger South Asian community is facing is something that is very real, right? The discrimination that they have faced in the post 9/11 period, or even before that, going back to early 20th century, right? And so I would say that the way that we bring this back to some of the important questions is to turn our attention to the question of discrimination in a more sort of in a more systematic manner, and in a more multifaceted manner, where we talk about discrimination in all its complexities, and try and then challenge the discourse of Hinduphobia or anti-Hindu discrimination, because it's trying to reduce this whole complex immigrant minority experience, non-Christian experience in the US, to a very narrow lens of Hinduphobia or anti-Hindu discrimination, right? Which is a very, very narrow interpretation, right? So it's not hard for us to actually expand this battle and to actually win this battle if we are able to think about discrimination is in a much more expansive way, right? I can talk more about this, but you get the larger picture that the larger point that I'm trying to make, that we have to take this as one of the important pillars of how we engage with this question, right? So we talk more about discrimination, we talk more about their experience, and we talk how the bullying that happens in a school or in a classroom cannot be reduced only to that person being Hindu, but that bullying has multiple dimensions. How do we understand that? And that will produce a very different kind of politics than the kind of politics Hinduphobia or anti-Hindu discrimination is asking us to sort of think about or adopt, right? So that's one point. The second point, and the last point, that's my last point, is that I think in both cases, in case of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism and the question of Israel and the question of Palestine, and then and the case of India, I think it's for me as somebody who studies South Asian, somebody who is more centered in the larger Asian American politics, I would say that if we want to think about this issue and if we want to engage with this issue, then one thing that we have to acknowledge, and it's very common sense, it's kind of, it was coming through all the points that different people were making in the presentations, that if you want to engage with this, then we have to think about politics in a transnational or global manner. Politics cannot be We cannot fight this whole issue by confining ourselves to the US or to Britain, whatever context we are in. We have to think about politics in a transnational or global manner, right? What's the whole discourse on Hinduphobia and anti-Hindu discrimination and weaponization of that is deeply, deeply linked to what is happening in India, right? And how Hinduism is being deployed in a particular way in India, how minorities are being treated in India, right? And whether it's question of Kashmir, Article 387, Article 335A or CAA or other things, right? That if we do not bring those questions to this whole discourse, then there is no chance that we will be able to actually challenge this discourse, right? Because this discourse is deeply, deeply embedded into what's happening in either Israel or in India, right? And so a more expansive notion of politics, which is more transnational, where you engage with these questions in transnational manners. I think that's the only way that we can engage with this question. And I think I'll stop and I will let others take it up.
Thank you very much, Sanjay. Sravya, please.
Yeah, so I just really, really loved what both Dr. Mishra said and Rabbi Alyssa said, which was about how we need to have a politics of solidarity with marginalized communities and not a politics of isolation. And what we're seeing with this Hinduphobia discourse is it's a politics of isolation, where Hindus are uniquely setting themselves apart from other people. And I think that there are two important questions that we need to ask when deciding whether a situation is actually some kind of discrimination, and how to deal with it. So the first question is, in a particular situation, is there harm being done to a community, and who is the harm being done to? And when we look at the issue, for example, of these caste-based resolutions, the first question we ask is there being harm, and is there harm being done? And that's certainly the case, because we know that Dalit and oppressed caste communities are facing discrimination and harm across the United States, across India. And then the second question we need to ask is there harm being done to dominant caste Hindus? And we know that that's not the case, that they're the people that are perpetrating the harm in these scenarios. If you pass a caste-based resolution, are you causing harm to dominant caste Hindus? No, there's no evidence of that. Just don't be casteist. That's the answer, right? So there's no harm that is being done to the people that are saying that they're being so harmed. There's absolutely no evidence of that, where there is evidence of caste discrimination. So then we can see that that is not an actual case of so-called Hinduphobia or anti-Hindu sentiment. And this goes to the case in India as well. Oftentimes when we try to bring up issues of the CAA or Kashmir or violence against Muslims in India at conferences and things, people will say, well, what about Pakistan? Well, what about Bangladesh? Well, what about Hindus in this and that country? And they turn it into a question of whataboutism. But the question that we always need to bring up is, okay, Hindus are being harmed here. Muslims are also being harmed in India. This is a both and situation. Both communities are being harmed. So why, instead of just ignoring one issue, you solve both issues? And then the second question, let's say that this issue of harm, or like who is being harmed, is not enough for you. And maybe you're an administrator, or you're a Hindu, and you believe, or you're not sure if something is really punishing your community for being Hindu or being upper caste or whatever this is. The next question you have to ask is, does claiming discrimination actually help your community? And is there an actual difference that is going to help your community in terms of solving discrimination? So one of the things that was just mind-boggling for me about the response to the conference is I just completely thought of this as a non-issue for Hindus. Like, first of all, I very much supported the conference because it was against Hindu nationalism, and I don't like Hindu nationalism. But even if, say, you were like a Hindu who just was living your day and you didn't care about politics, an academic conference, and maybe you even face some bias, like an academic conference, or this backlash to the academic conference isn't going to do anything for you. Like, it's not going to solve any of the problems of discrimination that you might face as a Hindu or as an Indian American. So having this giant backlash doesn't actually solve any problems. So I think these two questions, both, is there being harm and who is the harm being done to? And then, does claiming discrimination actually help your community? And is there a difference? Those are the crux of the two questions. And when there are cases, for example, when we could see in that case where I started to a Hindu Student Association, there was harm to us because we weren't able to start our club. And if we did, we ended up not doing that. But if we had said, hey, we feel like we're being discriminated against, there might have been remedial action that we could have taken. And that wouldn't have resulted in us attacking anyone. It would have resulted in us joining in solidarity with other minority communities to advocate for, hey, we need the space and we need support in creating it and kind of fighting all of these rumors that are going around about us. And then the last thing I just want to bring up is that there is some level of discourse on the left that says that, like, Hindus don't face discrimination at all. And I think it's just really important to say that we do need to address the challenges that Indian Americans and Hindus face, because otherwise people are going to move further to the right. If you are a generally centrist Hindu person, you have experienced some discrimination, if you feel like one side is telling you those experiences aren't real and they're false, there is a strong risk of moving to the right. And like when I was younger, if things have been different, if my ideas have been slightly different, I'd had slightly different experiences, that might have been what happened to me, and that might have happened to people that I know. And so I think that it's really important to definitely address how this is being misused and ask those critical questions and fight it when it's being misused, but also to remember that it does exist and to acknowledge that. So that's where I'll end.
Thank you very much, Lisa.
Yeah, I mean, I like that the discussion is getting to like practicalities of how to address it. So thank you for the question. I mean, I think one of the main challenges around this is that we are on the defensive, right? And there's like the burden of explanation is on us to draw the distinctions between religious identities and political ideologies, right? So even though the weaponizers are lying when they say it's anti-Jewish or anti-Hindu to critique policies and practices of the Indian or Israeli governments, explaining why that is in a really pithy way isn't challenging and an upstream battle, right? They've already put that out there, and like getting people's attention to re-explain it, I actually think is really hard. But that being said, there are some things that we can do as educators and community leaders. So I think like the first piece, which I think others have also spoken to, is like just really understanding what anti-Semitism and Hinduphobia are, and we're like what it really is, right? You know, people over the years have often asked me when I give talks like this one or talk about how it's not anti-Semitic to critique Israel. People often say like, well, what do I do when people say I'm anti-Semitic? Like, for example, when I was supporting Christian communities and church movements and supporting the boycotts, divestment, and sanctions movement, people would say that. And I would be like, well, are you? Like, standing for Palestinian freedom and holding Israel to account is not anti-Semitic, but that also doesn't mean that you don't hold wrong-headed ideas about Jews, right? So being anti-Zionist is not proof of being anti-Semitic, but it also doesn't absolve you of the ability to be. And I think that we have to continually interrogate or learn our biases, because when we don't, we're actually more vulnerable to accusations of anti-Semitism or anti-Hindu bias when we haven't interrogated, you know, the ways that we have internalized some of those messages, you know, just as like as white people, we have to do as on an ongoing basis of like unlearning the racism that we're taught. On more practical level, I feel like there are some things that we could do to stay more focused, right? Like, so one thing I think about is like not isolating anti-Semitism from other forms of oppression, right? Like, I think it's really important that we see them connected, because they are fundamentally, right? And that we fight them together and challenge political ideology that foment racism and fear. And at the same time, create spaces that affirm and celebrate many different expressions of culture and religious life. And so I think those are some of the important pieces. And I think the other thing we can do is be better about as a practice is banding together and insisting that we talk about the real issues, because that's the hardest piece, right? Like the last thing that the weaponizers want is to actually talk about the actions of Israel or India and how they match or diverge from Americans' values of democracy or equality or freedom of speech, embrace and respect for all cultures or whatever, right? So like a few weeks ago when Amnesty International, you know, like as it's been mentioned, like released their report finding Israel's practicing apartheid, you know, there wasn't an engagement of the details of the report, right? There's nothing, and it's like in all of my years, like 2 decades organizing on this issue, it's rare that I actually have a conversation that's about like what our values are and why we like inside the Jewish community and getting actually into the details, right? And I actually think academics and college campuses, like they are the hotbeds for a lot of these debates. And I think that actually makes sense, because I think they are the places to build the skills and practices to effectively push the conversation where we need them to be, which is on the realities of Palestinian lives. In the case of Israel, the realities of Palestinian lives living under apartheid and occupation. Like that's what we actually need to be discussing. And I think another really important thing that we can do is ensuring that we're always leading with our values, right? And not weaponized guilt, right? So one of the things that didn't mention before, but that's like part of this dynamic of the weaponization is that, you know, as white Jews gained access to whiteness post World War II in the United States, there was like a deal that was made between Jews and Christians, sometimes implicit and sometimes explicit, for Christians who wanted to befriend Jews and develop interfaith relationships, that they would be like, quote unquote, forgiven for their anti-Semitism and their participation or like lack of participation in opposing the Nazi Holocaust in exchange for biting their tongues on Israel, right? And that has been a deal that has existed and has actually held a lot of things in place. And so as over the past number of years, as like mainstream liberal Christian denominations, like the Methodists, the Presbyterians, the UCC, the Episcopalians, and the Quakers, like look to like actually challenge that deal, right? Like they've been met with some of the most fiercest attacks of this kind of charges of anti-Semitism. And when I was supporting the Presbyterians around their fights to align their values and their actions, you know, that's when I really got a crash course in this weaponization. This was like in 2012, 2014, where I heard and saw with my eyes rabbis threatening their friendship with these churches, like literally saying from the front of the room, if you vote to divest from the Israeli occupation, like our interfaith relationship is over, right? And so that's what we mean when we say weaponization. And the other thing is like, complicating, like part of the way that we got our, like the Presbyterians ultimately did vote to divest. And I think one of the reasons that happened was because we were able to complicate it enough. So it wasn't like, oh, you can listen to this Jew because the Jews agree, like Jews never speak in one voice, but all the more so on this issue. And I assume that's true for all religious and cultural groups, but, they were needing then to just lead with values. They just needed to decide like, what are our values? You can't just take your cue when you're trying to be quote unquote, like an ally, right, to Jews. And then here you have in front of you two rabbis, me and this other rabbi telling you two totally different things. That makes it up to you and your values. So that means for our purposes that we need to lead with our values so that people can then decide which side they're on by knowing who is reflecting their values. And I think the last piece is just, we really need to build up our courage. Like the reputational risk that one takes on to speak out for human rights for Palestinians is not for the faint of heart, right? There are hundreds of examples of professors losing their jobs, students being threatened with their placements, right? Like there's this shadowy website called Canary Mission, which its whole purpose is to create profiles of pro-Palestinian activists. And they say, quote unquote, their goal is, quote unquote, ensure that today's radicals are not tomorrow's employees. They're like literally trying to stop people's careers. And so in the face of how real that is, right? We need to build our spiritual courage and our moral courage. And for me, that is found in multiracial, multi-religious coalitions of co-resistance. So I'd love to build that together with all of you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So, Josh.
Thanks. Let me first of all just echo the calls that we've been hearing for intersectional alliances, which is so important. And that's going to mean sometimes setting differences aside for a greater cause of this intersectional alliance. I'm reminded, for example, of one of my sort of someone who inspires me a lot, even though we disagree on some things. Jill Jacobs, Sravya Jill Jacobs, who writes about how she works with the Catholic Church, on whom they disagree about lots of things. They worked on a campaign to end solitary confinement in America because they both agreed that it was wrong. Sometimes you have to do that. And I think to a certain extent, my goal has been to get Jews who are, let's say, to my right on Israel, to set that aside, their concerns about whatever they believe in Israel, to make those alliances with other vulnerable minorities, in fact, far more vulnerable minorities. And I mean, when Rabbi Weiss talked about the Holocaust, there's a phrase that actually got popularized by Meir Kahane, but it's never again, right? So what does never again mean? So on the one hand, never again, I was raised the way she was. Never again meant a sort of bellicose, militant Jewish state that would never allow itself to be overrun. But never again could equally mean, and I take it that way now and have raised my children this way, never again to anyone else will this happen, to Jews or anyone else. And that means a very different response. I'll leave it at that. And then the other comment I'll make before I give, there's been a request for specifics. So I'm going to try to be as specific as I can. In terms of risk, I don't judge anyone with a vulnerable profession for being careful. Rabbis with congregants, academics who are not yet tenured, people who are vulnerable, I never judge them for what they can and can't do safely. For myself, from the moment I received tenure, and for any academic with tenure, there was no excuse from my mind. Sure, speaking out could have some consequences, lost opportunities of speaking. There's certainly lost rewards. If you toe the line, there's a lot of money to be made. But when you have tenure, I feel that the only purpose of that is to be able to speak truth to power. So I would just echo what she said on that. Now, as they say in Hebrew, tachlis, as they say, how do you respond to this weaponization? I would answer a few ways. First of all, defend academic freedom, and by the way, economic freedom at every single turn. Invite robust conversations, invite the conversations, respond to the suppression by saying, let's talk about this, recognize parallel narratives, recognize that there may not be a middle ground, but the conversations have to happen. And frankly, from an American perspective, it's very hard to argue against the logic of economic freedom if you're coming from the right. The logic of saying, there's one thing to say, it's one thing to say we are banning trade with this country because it is at war with us, or we're boycotting Russia because of what they're doing in Ukraine. It's another thing to say we are insisting you do business with India. We are insisting you do business with Israel, and if you don't, we are going to ban you from government contracts. That's a very different, and I would argue, from an American perspective, very problematic logic that I think we can very easily oppose. So that's number one, is to defend academic freedom and defend economic freedom. Number two, focus on facts on the ground. In other words, respond to red herrings, to distractions by bringing the conversation back to the ground. If someone wants to say, if you talk about what's happening on the ground in India or on the ground in Israel, and someone says, well, why are you talking about that? What about this? And what about the Holocaust? And what about the other place? So, okay, yeah, but let's first of all clarify, what's the reality on the ground? Are you okay with that? Are we okay with that? What's actually happening? That's something that is a conversation all of us in this call and in the audience probably have had countless times. And it takes persistence and patience, and if it's the right time of day, probably a beer, but it pays off, and it really pays off to stay focused on the ground and to respond to red herrings by bringing the conversation back to the reality on the ground. Third of all, focus on the actual myths of anti-Semitism or anti-Hindu hatred. Ask the question, from my perspective, how does anti-Zionism that you're identifying, or anti-Israel rhetoric, how does it fit into anti-Semitism? Why is this anti-Semitic? Why exactly, right? Is it pushing an anti-Semitic narrative, or is it merely arguing for equalization of power? or Palestinian rights, right? What exactly about this is anti-Semitic? Force people to state out or to see what they're doing. Because I think, honestly, you know, as I get older, I think a lot of people are okay. They're not bad people. They just aren't thinking it through. People have busy lives. People have families and children and jobs and lots of things. And not everybody is as committed to these projects as those of us on this call are right now, probably in the audience as well. And I think forcing people to think through the logic of what they're arguing and forcing them to refocus on what exactly constitutes anti-Semitism or religious bigotry or racism, focusing on that is very important. And you do this by asking very simple questions. When someone says boycotting Israel is anti-Semitic, then you ask, how exactly does one advocate for Palestinian equality without being anti-Semitic? What exactly can you do that is considered okay? How do I advocate for equality without being anti-Semitic, right? Are you calling the opposing nationalist movement anti-Semitic by definition? And if so, based on what, right? Is the Jewish narrative good and of national liberation, good and noble, but the opposing one is anti-Semitic? Ask why. What do you see there exactly? How is that possible? That's my fourth point. Fifth point, and this was already raised, I think, by Sravya and maybe some others as well. Acknowledge the other point as much as possible. Recognize actual anti-Semitism. It exists. It's a problem. In fact, in the era of Trump, it's become quite problematic. And I don't just mean because of the Tree of Life synagogues and other attacks on synagogues. In political rhetoric, it's become normalized in really dangerous ways. So acknowledge that. Talk about it. Including, by the way, as I mentioned earlier, when Israel is standing in for collective Jewry in some globalist sense. That's problematic. As Rabbi Weiss pointed out, there is anti-Zionist anti-Semitism. And by the way, there is a lot of Zionist anti-Semitism. Being anti-Zionist or Zionist is in no way a sign that you are or not propagating anti-Semitism. Talk about that, tease this out. And if it's happening, I acknowledge the point. If you're seeing someone talk about Israel as a puppet master controlling Moscow and Washington and Paris and London, you got to call that out. And yes, that's a problem. That is hitting the anti-Semitism mythology. Recognize rhetoric that rather than wanting to achieve equality, wants to flip subordination in some way, wants to deny Jews equality. That exists. I've seen it. It's out there. Acknowledge that's a problem. When you're calling for equality, that means equality. That doesn't mean making a new subaltern group under the current subalterns. It means equality. And if someone responds to this, if you have notions of security, I've often pointed out, going back to Pharaoh in the book of Exodus, defense of persecution of minorities has almost always been done in the name of security and defense. It's, Pharaoh, if you know your Bible, Pharaoh famously said, let's get wise with these Israelites. Someday they might be a danger to us. We should enslave them first. We should hurt them before they can hurt us. And you see this in defense of slavery back in the day. You see it in antebellum America. You see this in defense of Jim Crow, in the defense of apartheid. You see this in Nazism. It was a defensive action. Before they could harm us, we have to kill the Jews, right? A persecution like that is always defended this way. And no one has the right, I can acknowledge the cause of self-determination of any national group. I don't think nationalism is a very good way of organizing the globe, personally. I think it's very problematic and leads to war and persecution. But I can acknowledge the point that that's how we're doing it, and therefore this group is vulnerable, they should have self-determination, but no one has that right at the cost of hurting somebody else. Similarly, I would say, we talked earlier about the way that politics and religion mix. In Hinduism, which I've learned a lot about today, and certainly in Judaism, politics and religion mix. And I do not know, we live in a world now of religious diversity. Judaism is broken up into lots of denominations: Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, Ultra-Orthodox of different types, Hasidic, anti-Hasidic, and Zionist forms of Jewishness. And I'm not God. I have no idea what is the best collection of Jewish traditions to make an authentic Jew. I don't know. I know what I want for myself. I'm an active Jew. I know what I think is authentic. It's based on humanism. It's based on human rights. It's based on people being created in the image of God. It's based on covenant and ritual as well. I have a whole set of ideas which I could share on another occasion over a beer, but I don't know if I'm right. I'm a pluralist. Maybe the Reform are correct. Maybe the ultra-Orthodox are right. I don't know. Maybe the Zionists are right. Let them live with the way they want to live, but no one, that's pluralism, but it can't be based on oppression. It cannot be based on oppression, whether it's an individual oppression or collective oppression. And that's my last point. We have to move from national narratives to talk more about human rights, about the individual. The discussion has to be about human rights. And this reminds me of what Sravya was saying earlier about what's happening on the ground, who's suffering right now, and what do we want to accomplish? If we move the conversation from grand nationalist narratives to the level of the human being and individual human rights, I think the conversation will be a lot more productive. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much to all our panelists for some really great discussion here. Can you all hear me? I just got a message. Thank you. So I just want to very quickly summarize and maybe in the remaining moments take a few questions here. It was very important to raise the issue of focusing on the real harm that is being done and really think about who is facing that harm. I also think a very important point about expanding the narratives about discrimination, not isolating the focus on one national community, but going towards a more transnational concept of discrimination and discrimination across communities is an excellent way to go. I will maybe start off with summarizing two different questions that actually really point to the heart of this conversation here. Someone here asked, what networks exist, or maybe I should say what networks should be promoted to examine the similarities in rhetoric that we are seeing here. And along with that, a similar question, what kind of methodologies might scholars of various disciplines adopt to create alternative narratives so that we prevent alternative narratives from being weaponized discourses? So I will hand it over to any of the panelists. I suppose what we're doing today is creating one such network to examine commonalities. But does anyone want to take this question? Maybe you have existing networks that you can tell us about, or some ideas for interdisciplinary work in this area.
Well, I can talk about Hindus for Human Rights. So before we came along 2 years ago, there was really only one major Hindu organization that would speak out on politics in India, and that was the Hindu American Foundation. And their politics were very right-wing, pro-Hindutva. They are modeling themselves to be like AIPAC. They were doing that, they've been doing that for a long time. And really how Hindus for Human Rights kind of modeled itself is after Alyssa's organization, Jewish Voices for Peace, as we really took inspiration from that and JVP's work at combating Zionism and from a Jewish faith perspective. So likewise, we are trying to combat Hindutva and Hindu nationalism from a Hindu faith perspective. So if you are really passionate about combating Hindutva, and if you're Hindu, and definitely check out our work, and definitely check out JVP's work as well. I don't know if Alyssa, you want to say?
No, I think that's great. And I think like the thing is that we do that we need to create more and more opportunities. And I think, what the stuff I've seen on college campuses, like that's one of the most, like when I was working with college students who were working on for, divestment resolutions or other kinds of activity on their college campuses, the list of the the co-sponsoring campus groups was always really startling and amazing. And I always like aspired to that, right? Like when an SJP chapter was like, had a resolution and it was just like literally like all of the student groups were like signed on to it. And I guess I have always been holding on like, what's the community parallel? Like, how do you take that out of a campus sphere and bring it out into the world where like we have each other's backs on an ongoing way? And I think like this like partnership with Hindus for Human Rights and JVP that are so naturally aligned and figuring out how else that happens, where when we issue a statement, getting people to like endorse it and or high five it or signal boost it, right? Like those are the kinds of things that I think are actually like the action oriented stuff, showing up at each other's events, like being in social media together, like letting people see that we're related. It's like those kinds of things that are really, really important.
would quickly add that the conference that we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, right? Dismantling Global Hindutva Conference, DGH. Lots of scholars from all across in the US, in India, across in diaspora, they came together and they presented their ideas about how to think about the present political movement and the moment that India is going through, and how Hindu identity is being deployed, weaponized, etc. Right. So that's, I would, if somebody is looking for sort of interdisciplinary or sort of academic conversation on this question, I would say that just research that, just look at the schedule and the presentation. Some of the recordings are available, right? And so amazing conversations, some of the most difficult conversation, right? That one of the premises of the conference was that there is a neat way to distinguish between Hinduism and Hindutva, right? Some people challenge that, right? That can we really do that? Are they not really enmeshed, right? And so so there's a lot there, and absolutely, I mean, I think there's a lot of work going on, and the power of that work can be only sort of sensed through the kind of attack that it received, right? And the kind of demonization that happened of that conference. So absolutely, there's a lot. The other thing I would say that the mobilization that is happening across the US and in diaspora, it's all about networks. It's all about networks of Muslims in diaspora, Kashmiris in diaspora, caste oppressed in diaspora, Christians in diaspora, right? And so if they are making any gains at any front, for example, Seattle came up, right? So see, in Seattle, they were able to get the resolution passed against CAA. That was a big thing. Just look at that example and look at the kind of coalitions that were built in Seattle to get that resolution passed. That was not easy, right? And so amazing work is happening across the US, and Hindus for Human Rights, for example, is a part of that, right? So I feel really hopeful in terms of how it's unfolding and what's happening, and also very scary moment, also the kind of attack that we faced.
I would just add, so this is the kind of event that we need to have more of, and I really gained so much from this. And I'll say, from my perspective, I'm not following. I joked when we started that I really don't know almost anything about what's happening. And I know roughly the nature of the regime and roughly what's happening, but no details. And I really need to be much more active. I need to follow it more. I need to educate myself, and I need to become active in that discourse, making these connections and pushing in intersectional notions of human rights. And so one thing we can do is, all of us can do this. Those of us who are like me, who come from an area that know a lot about Israel-Palestine, but much less about other areas, need to educate ourselves and become active. And I think vice versa as well. I would just say that there seems to be two areas that we can work. One of them is about discourse and education. And all of us can be active. And really, all of us can be much more active. In the last few years, I've become extremely interested in writing in the popular press. It's really not hard. I mean, they're desperate for intelligent articles, intelligent lessons about different things. Anyone who feels they have some expertise and an important opinion that's relevant and timely, a lot more people can become published and become active in print and on internet versions of papers. And when you publish something online, unless you're a Twitter megastar with millions of followers, you'll get more by publishing in a journal than you will anywhere else. And I encourage everyone to do that, to try to shape the discourse, to try to shape how we think and how we talk in ways I mentioned earlier. But I would also just add, as the title of a book I read recently put it, politics is for power. It's not a hobby. Power matters. And so I would just encourage everyone to remember, and I don't do nearly enough of this myself, local politics, registering voters, talking to people, bringing people to the polls, that kind of thing, traditional grassroots politics. I don't do nearly enough. I do more than I used to, but I think that also matters a lot. And we shouldn't forget that it's not just about shaping discourse and education, but it's also about power and about politics shaping the laws that govern our lives. So I would add that as well.
Thank you. We have just a little bit more time, but I wanted to, another question that came in was particularly about the Indian diaspora in the US, but it's also relevant for, at least for some Jews in the US. It's about how many people tend to be more on the left concerning US politics, but then in relation to India or in relation to Israel, tend to be much more on the conservative right. Is there a way to channel, right, the left on the level of the youth, at least on the younger people, in this kind of system that we see, you know, in the Jewish world, at least from my experience, we see still quite a lot, and it is, you know, generational to some extent.
I'll jump in just for a moment, and then I'll let others speak. There is a, you know, progressive accept Palestine. It's a very common phenomenon. I think most of what I've said tonight has been speaking to that crowd. You know, it's very hard to get someone who really believes in ethno-nationalism, who actually defends oppression openly, who knows what they're doing, and they think that's fine. Whether it's because they have hatred burning in their heart or because their lesson of the Holocaust is screw the rest of the world, we're going to do whatever we want to do. It's very hard to reach that. But the sort of tactics I've been discussing, focusing on the reality on the ground, reminding people of their values, pointing out what they're actually arguing, that I think does make progress. And I have many personal stories I can tell you where I've broken through to people, including myself. I want to point out, again, I think I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, I used to live in a West Bank settlement, in an ultra-Orthodox West Bank settlement. It is other people who spoke to me this way and pointed out inconsistencies in my, you know, in my own theology and ideology and problems that I was ignoring on the ground, who patiently moved me, that had that effect on me. And I've certainly, I think I know that I've had that effect on some others, and not always, but I think if we meet with people who are essentially good people, who have good values, but for whatever reason, they are checking them because of the way they are raised, either for religious reasons or because it's more comfortable that way. You make them uncomfortable, you point out the problems, and you point out that it's okay, and you challenge them in this way, and you give them time to absorb it. And I do think you can move the needle. I don't have any hope of moving the needle on somebody who actually believes in ethno-nationalist oppression, who actually thinks it's a good thing. I don't think anything we're talking about is going to move such a person. I really don't. But the people you describe, I think this is exactly what we're talking about.
Okay. If anyone has really last comments, but just for a minute or two, and then we'll wrap it up. Any of the other speakers would like to say a
So on the question that you raised, I think that's an important question. And I would say that left in US politics and on the right in the context of India or Israel, that's something that's difficult to sort of disentangle. But I think one of the things that we have to remember that particularly when I'm thinking about Indian diaspora or Hindu diaspora in the US, there is a way in which both, I think at this moment, both right and left, people who are aligned to the right-wing politics in India and people who are aligned against right-wing politics in India, both are kind of feel that Democratic Party is their home. Right. And so you will see a lot of infighting within Democratic Party between these two factions. Right. And so and that's because of the nature of US politics, such that at this moment, the politics of white racial resentment is completely taken up by the Republican Party. And it's very hard for large minority groups to align itself with Republican Party, right? And so you see both kind of moving towards Democratic Party, right? That's one. And the second, I would say, and I hesitate to say this, but I would still say that the nature of diasporic mobilization by Hindu nationalists or by Israeli state is such that they want to overblow the kind of support that they have in diaspora, right? So by nature, they would say that our support is all encompassing, right? All Indians or all Hindus do support us. I don't think that is true. That's the nature of mobilization, right? That's what BJP wants to project. That's what Modi wants to project. Whenever it comes to the US, That's the tack that it takes. That's very important to keep in mind, that what we see is not the actual reality, and we have to investigate the reality in more sort of more thorough and more empirical manner.
Lisa, final words, Sravya, anything?
I think that pretty much summed it up. I want to echo what Dr. Mishra said, that I also think that it's exaggerated, this idea that all of the Hindus are universally on this train supporting Modi. That being said, a lot of Indian Americans support Modi. And there is that trend of supporting the right wing. And so I think what's actually the strategy needs to be is going for people who haven't really decided which camp they're in, to be educating those people about the oppression and atrocities going on in India, because those are the people that can actually be swayed to the left. Whereas my interactions with right-wing people are that they're in their camp and they're locked in.
Lisa?
No, I don't have anything to add to that particular question, but thank you again for hosting this. And I hope it is just the beginning of further conversations around it. And I do see that there's some questions in the chat that are about kind of what are, what more do we know? And I think there is more research that needs to be done about exactly what the sharing of propaganda strategies are between Israel and India, and really understanding that further. Like, we know things that are anecdotal about delegations of Indian American college activists, for example, to Israel with Jewish college activists, where they came back and created social media accounts that really are parallel, just like different fonts and different colors, but like the same strategy. There's one called like Jewish on campus and one called Hindu on campus. And so that's one example. And then, Azad, I see your question about I don't know about if there's an international definition of Hinduphobia being formed, but I heard that there was, and I tried to research it and I couldn't figure it out, along the lines of the HfHR definition of anti-Semitism, that something could be drafted along those same lines. And I don't know if that was just rumor, but I think it just makes me more curious and wanting to figure out how we can do more research and sharing more information. And I think figuring out if there are other examples of religious nationalisms that we need to integrate here. I mean, I know that there are some moves here in the US by the Poor People's Campaign and Showing Up for Racial Justice and other groups that are actually challenging Christian nationalism, which is actually really important. So I also be curious about integrating that into these kinds of these kinds of conversations. So I'm game, for the record, I'm game for keeping going on this conversation, however we can figure out to do it next.
I will just add one very quick response to that. There is, in fact, a move by the Indian government to introduce a formal definition of Hinduphobia in the United Nations context. So that is worrying, and that's something definitely that in the definitional context that has been, that we've seen around anti-Semitism, I think there's a lot of scholarship to be done on these definitions. Thank you, and I'll hand it over to Raz to just close us out.
Thank you so much, everyone, for a terrific discussion, an important discussion, urgent, as many of you have said. And I really hope that this is, the first, and we'll continue it and broaden the lens, as you said, Lisa. I will say that a key issue is, of course, building of solidarity, maintaining solidarity, enhancing that. I think that's a key here. And so I look forward to inviting you again, to inviting others with you, and to continuing the discussion. Thank you for everyone who attended. Take care.
Thank you so much. That was terrific. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye.